welcome to this After Effects introduction class. My name is Emmanuel. I'm going to be teaching you for the next couple of days. I'm a freelance illustrator. I've been working for the last sort of 8 years since graduating from uni. I've picked up a bit of animation and graphic design work along the way. So I've got quite a bit of experience with After Effects. So After Effects is a animation and motion graphics piece of software. We can use it to make stuff move. It also functions as, I guess, a compiler. If you have assets that you've made elsewhere, you can compile them all into a composition and get them to move and interact with each other and that sort of thing. So I'll just go through some nice examples of the sorts of things that we can do, ranging from branding and design and illustrated animations. I'm just going to spend a bit of time going through how we set up a project in After Effects and general interface. When you click on new project, you'll get led to the After Effects interface, which I think people tend to find quite intimidating, but once we start to break it down, you'll see it's actually fairly simple. You should have two big buttons in the middle. One of them says new composition and the other says new composition from footage. Within After Effects, we, unlike other Adobe programs, can only have one project open at a time, but that project is made up of different compositions. So projects in After Effects are made up of compositions, and compositions are folders where we store assets. So another way of thinking about compositions could be as a scene. One scene may have a flower and a table, and within that scene, you animate that flower and the table. And then another scene may have a cat and a rug, and in that scene, that's what you have. So you can store these compositions as separate things, or you can sequence compositions together, or you can put other compositions within other compositions to make more complex animations. I'll show an example of that a little bit later. If we click through to new composition, we can name our composition. We can set a preset for the composition underneath. Within this drop-down menu, we've got various different presets for compositions in terms of the pixel size, the resolution, and the frame rate. So a lot of these are, again, intimidating looking, but usually the only ones that you'll need to pay attention to are probably the HD TV ones. These are the ones that equate to actual TVs that you get in the shop or you get in your living room. So there should be one that says HD TV 1080/25, if you could find that, or it might say, depending on your version of After Effects, HD 1920 by 1080. All the preset option does is change these options here. We can change these ourselves. Let's make sure that we're working on a width of 1920 and a height of 1080. So that's standard widescreen size. But if you were perhaps doing an advert for Instagram, you might want to do a square. So something like 1080 by 1080 is probably what you want. If you wanted to do something like an Instagram story, then it's widescreen flipped on its head. So it would be a width of 1080 and a height of 1920. So just exactly the same thing, just the values switched. So we'll be working at a width of 1920 and a height of 1080. No need to worry about pixel aspect ratio. Just make sure that's set to square, which in 99% of cases will be set to square already. Underneath that, we've got the frame rate. So all moving image, animation, movies, etc., are basically just still images played back to you really fast to give the illusion of movement. And the frame rate is the speed at which you're shown these still images or frames within 1 second. So we currently got it set to 25 frames per second, meaning that After Effects is going to show us 25 images within 1 second. In the drop-down menu, you can see various different other sort of pre-selected frame rates. Others that you may encounter would be something like 23.976, which is the cinematic standard. You got things like 60, which extreme sports or high intensity videos may be shot at, or some video games will play back at. Animation can be anywhere from 12 to 30, it really depends. a higher frame rate doesn't necessarily mean that something's going to look better. I think it was The Hobbit that was shot and played back at 48 frames per second in the cinema, and people said it looked really weird and gave them motion sickness. So yeah, just because you make something at a high frame rate doesn't mean it's going to look better. We're going to work at a frame rate of 25 frames per second, just because as we start to time things along our animation, 25 is a really nice round number to do this by. This resolution is just a preview option. I'll come back to this in a second. The duration is the length of our composition. So within our project, all of our compositions can have different lengths. Let's set this to 300 frames. Sorry, actually 250 frames, which will give us a length of 10 seconds. So at 25 frames per second, 250 frames is going to be 10 seconds in length. If yours is set as seconds, then seconds, change 30 to 10. So if you just change the number 3. And we'll change yours to frames in a second. The width will be 1920, the height will be 1080, the frame rate will be 25, the duration will be 250. And this background color is not the actual color of our background, it's just a color that's used for preview purposes. We'll have to add a colored background in ourselves. But for now, let's change this background color to gray. If you set the B to 75 and leave everything else alone, that will get us a nice 25% gray. Just because working on black makes things hard to see, working on stark white isn't on the eyes, so a nice gray. And then click OK. So we've now got a composition. This large area here is the composition view. It's where our big gray rectangle is. On the left-hand side, we've got the project window. This is where all the assets within our project will sit. So you can see we've got one composition here. All our compositions will appear here. All of our dragged in illustrations, design assets, music, pre-made videos, etc., will appear here. They can be dragged into the composition as needed. We've got our layers panel here, which is currently empty because there's nothing that we have in our composition just yet. And then we have our timeline here. Right now, my timeline is set to seconds because I just changed it to seconds. I want to make sure that we're all working with frames so that we can time things a little bit more easily. So if yours is displayed in seconds, in order to change this, we would need to go to File and then Project Settings, which should be near the bottom. And then Time Display Style. And set it from time code to frames. If I'm working with lots of video footage, sometimes it's easier to work with time code, in my opinion. But if I'm working with sort of motion graphics, shape, design assets, I usually tend to work in frames. But that is just a personal preference. So let's click OK. And when you do that, you should notice that your seconds turn into frames. So each notch is 25 frames, and it goes up in 25 frames increments. So 25, 50, 75, etc. So we've got the toolbar up at the top here. I'm not going to spend too long talking about this just now, but there is a shape tool, and yours may not be a rectangle. If you click and hold, you'll see that we have a hidden list of shapes to choose from. Let's just choose the rectangle tool. And let's draw a rectangle in the top left of our composition. You can hold down Shift and it will be a perfect square. With this rectangle, you'll see it has a fill and a stroke option at the top, just like in Illustrator. I can change the fill or the stroke color by clicking on the colored square next to it. To the right of the stroke, there's the weight of the stroke as well. I can just drag that number left and right to increase or decrease it. I want to get rid of either the fill or the stroke, then I need to click on the word fill or stroke. So for example, if I click on the word stroke, there's an option to get rid of that stroke. So I can also choose to have something that's just a stroke rather than a fill. So I can get rid of the fill if I click on the word fill, etc. Do all sorts. If I want to bring them back, then I need to click on that word again and just set it to a solid color. I'll get rid of my stroke for now, but feel free to keep yours. There's a move tool on the far left of the toolbar, which allows us to move our square around. Makes sense. And just like in other Adobe programs, holding down Shift while I move something forces me into moving it at 45-degree angles if I want to be really precise. So when we drew that shape, you'll notice that our layers panel got populated. We got a shape layer 1. Underneath that shape layer 1, we can see another folder that says contents with a rectangle 1 in it, because we have this rectangle in our contents folder. But we're going to ignore this contents folder for the moment. So I'm going to click on that little arrow next to it just to hide that rectangle 1. It's important to only show and hide things that you're working on that you need at any point in time, because otherwise the After Effects interface can get a little bit congested. But underneath that shape layer 1, there's another folder called transform. Let's twirl that open. And you'll see that we have various different transformational values, things like position, scale, rotation, and opacity. With the selection tool, if I move my square around, you'll see that the coordinates of the position change. Because my composition is 1920 by 1080 pixels, if I move my square's anchor point, that's the center point of it, to the bottom, you'll see that those coordinates will change to 1920 by 1080 or thereabouts. On the top left, it will be 0 by 0. So if I know exactly where I want my square to be, I can just put those values in, or I can just move it more intuitively. If your anchor point's not in the center and it gets uncentered very easily, very often, we can recenter it by going to layer and then transform and then center anchor point in layer content. We'll be coming back to that a lot. I'm just going to go through each of these transformations and how they work. The way that animation works in After Effects is through keyframing. Keyframes in animation are like key states, where all we have to do to make something move is identify its key states and then get After Effects to do everything else, essentially. So if something's going to move from, if this square is going to move from left to right, there are only two keyframes involved in that, the square on the left and then the square on the right. So all we have to do is tell After Effects that at one point in time, the square will be on the left, at another point in time in the future, it will be on the right, and then After Effects is going to do everything else for us. It will figure out how to get there. So the way that we'll do this is actually very intuitive. All we're going to do is go to a point in time on the timeline and tell After Effects where we want it to be at that point in time. So if we're going to do this with our square's position, first we need to activate the square's positional keyframes. To the left of these values, there's a little stopwatch, and clicking on that stopwatch will activate the keyframes for that value. So when I click on the stopwatch for position, you'll notice that I get a little diamond in the timeline. I'll move my time indicator to the right a little bit just so that we can see that. So this little diamond is a keyframe, which means that at this point in time, at 0 frames, After Effects is going to remember where this square is. So now to do the next keyframe, all I have to do is go to another point in time in the future and then move the square into that position. So let's say I want it to take 2 seconds or 50 frames. All I need to do is move my time indicator to frame 50. And then move the square off to the right. Remember that I can hold down Shift so that it goes in a straight line. And I'll just move that square to the other corner. You'll notice that a path drags out from it. And this is the path that the square will take to now get to this position. If I now move my time indicator back to 0, you'll see that scrubbing through, it moves. Let's go back to 0 and then press spacebar. And then my square moves from left to right. So it's all quite intuitive.